Hello there. This week we're looking at the biological perspective. I'm so excited. It's one of my favorite chapters. We have looked at the neuron, we've looked at the nervous system, and now we're going to go on and look at the brain. But the question is, how do we look at the brain without being invasive, without basically doing brain surgery? Well, that's a big question that neuroscientists have been asking for years. In fact, in history, neuroscientists wanted to be able to look at the workings of the brain. So in 1918, the American neurosurgeon by the name of Walter Dandy introduced this technique called ventriculography, whereby images of the ventricular system within the brain were obtained by injection of filtered air directly into one or both lateral ventricles of the brain via one or small trephine holes drilled into the skull under local anesthesia. Okay, so this doesn't sound non-invasive. They're actually drilling holes into the brain and they're putting air into the brain, and they said that this wasn't very painful, but it definitely put patients at risk. Put them at risk of hemorrhages, infections, and dangerous changes in their intracranial pressure. Nevertheless, though, the surgical information given by this method was often remarkably precise and greatly enlarged the capabilities and accuracy of neurosurgical treatment. So today what we're going to look at is the modern ways that we look at the brain. And hopefully by the end of this lecture, you're going to be able to distinguish between the different types of brain scans. So how do we look at the brain? Well, these are a list of the different brain scans we're going to look at today. You don't have to write all of them down because we're actually going to get to each one individually. And so just have some patience here. Okay, so the first brain scan we're looking at is actually called an EEG. It was a major breakthrough in brain research, which happened actually in 1929. Hans Berger demonstrated the first human EEG. This was a machine that measured and records the electrical activity of the brain. So it's technically not called a brain scan, but it can record the information that's going on, the electrical information going on in the brain. Electrodes basically are placed on specific sites of the scalp. The electrical impulses of the brain are detected and recorded then. The frequency is the number of times a wave passes within a second, and a pen is hooked up to an instrument and records on graph paper the small electrical currents of the frequency. If a frequency is shown and it is excessive or deficient, mental performance will suffer. This test is now used as a diagnostic test in psychiatry and neurology. It is a common tool used today in brain research. The EEG is technically, again, not a brain scan, but it's a useful way of non-invasively observing signals from the brain. It can show how long the brain takes to process a stimuli, or show if a person is asleep or awake. If you've ever had a sleep study, or if you know somebody who has, they've had an EEG that will measure what brain waves are taking place during their sleep cycles. If somebody has also had an accident and they're unconscious, they will do an EEG in order to see, are they brain, is their brain still active? If there is no electrical impulses, unfortunately, then the patient is diagnosed as clinically brain dead. Sometimes it is used for the assessment of brain damage, or again, to assess brain death. The test is in real time. This means that the test is sensitive to brain abnormalities only while it is being administered. Also, those who do have epilepsy will have a normal EEG brain scan. This is an excellent tool to use with other brain scans to get a bigger picture of what's going on in the patient's brain. The first detailed picture of a living brain was taken by a CT scanner in 1971. CT stands for computerized tomography, and CT scanners became important for diagnosis within hospitals during the late 20th century. Unlike X-ray machines, CT scanners send multiple X-ray beams through the body at different angles. This is called tomography. Detectors inside the machine record how the beams pass through sections of the body. A computer uses complex mathematics to process these measurements and construct an internal image of the body displayed on a monitor. It is a scan. It can detect some brain damage and show local changes in cerebral flow. This measures brain activity. The CAT scan is considered a low-risk procedure. The amount of radiation a person receives is minute. The CAT scan is available at almost every acute care facility in the United States today. It is fast and is preferable over MRIs for acute cases of trauma. Shortly after the initial development of CAT scans, magnetic resonance imaging, or MRIs, was developed. Rather than using ionizing or X-ray radiation, MRIs use the variation of signals produced by protons in the body when the head is placed in a strong magnetic field. As you can see, the picture in an MRI is much clearer than that of a CAT scan. Positron emission tomography, or PET, is an imaging modality that was initially used for the study of brain function through the use of radioisotopes. A lot of work has gone into the development of safe radioisotopes to be injected into humans, along with the improvement of the hardware and software comprising a PET scanner. The field has come a long way, and currently PET is used for the detection of Alzheimer's disease, to study the effects of stroke and epilepsy, and to locate tumors. The main clinical uses for oncology imaging of the brain: head, neck, lungs, breast, colorectal, and prostate. As more safe radioisotopes are developed and as improvements are made to PET scanners, the uses will continue to increase. My mom, when she had cancer, we went over to Stanford, and she right away was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer because a tumor or a lymph node was found to have cancer cells outside of the original cancer site. When we went to Stanford, they came up with this plan. The plan was going to be that she does the surgery and has, a hysterectomy and removes as much of the cancer as possible, and then she would go into chemotherapy. Well, we went in for a PET scan, though, to make sure that they could really determine where all the sites are that the cancer had spread to. One thing we know about cancer is that it loves sugar. And so they injected her with a glucose solution. And so wherever the cancer cells were, it lit up. As you can see on these scans of these brains, the parts that are lit up is where whatever they're looking for. If it's cancer cells, those would be cancer cells. I'm hoping for the sake of this person, it's not cancer, because it looks like there's a lot of stuff lighting up. What happened was they looked at the scans, though, after she did the PET scan, and realized she had cancer throughout her body. And that they basically said, hey, if we do surgery on you and remove all the cancer, that surgery itself will kill you. And so why don't we change our plan and do chemo first, shrinking back the cancer cells, and then we'll go ahead and do surgery and remove the larger tumors. So that is what happened. And you know what? It worked for a short term. Next, we go to the functional MRI. The functional MRI is a functional magnetic resonance imaging, and it's a special type of MRIs that measure brain activity by detecting changes in blood flow. When a brain area is more active, it consumes more oxygen, so blood flow increases in that area. An fMRI can reveal which areas of the brain perform specific functions, such as thought, speech, or movement. So in the scan here on the screen, you'll see the brain at a resting state, and those pieces that are lit up are basically the part of the brain that is being activated. The next slide over is movie watching. And if you look carefully, there are different parts of the brain that are stimulated. Now, my question here is, what kind of movie would they be watching? Would it stimulate different areas if it was a comedy versus a horror film or a thriller? Our last one is task-based. And as you can see, even different areas of the brain have been lit up. The imaging method is used to help doctors see the effects of a stroke, trauma, brain tumors, or diseases such as Alzheimer's. It can also help guide doctors as they perform radiation, surgery, or other treatments of the brain. There is an interesting story about a man named Jason Paget who was attacked outside a bar one night. He had never been very academic and definitely not mathematical when he was in high school. But during the attack, Jason suffered a traumatic brain injury. After he recovered, though, he literally saw the world differently. When he views the world around him, he sees an assortment of shapes and what they call fractals. It's basically calculus. He had an fMRI done and found out that he had basically the conscious access to parts of the brain that he had conscious access to parts of the brain that the rest of us don't. They believe that through neuroplasticity, his brain rewired itself and made new connections that most people don't have. Now, don't go out and try to injure your brain to help you in math. Odds are it will have an opposite effect, and you know what? None of us can afford that. Our last scan we're going to look at is the SPECT scan. The SPECT is a nuclear imaging scan that integrates computed tomography, which is like a CT, and a radioactive tracer. The tracer is what allows doctors to see how blood flows to tissues and organs. Before the SPECT scan, a tracer is injected into your bloodstream, and the tracer is radio-labeled, meaning it emits gamma rays that can be detected by the CT scanner. The computer collects the information emitted by the gamma rays and displays it on the CT cross-sections. These cross-sections can be added back together to form a 3D image of your brain. This test differs from PET scans in that the tracer stays in your bloodstream rather than being absorbed by surrounding tissues, thereby limiting the images to areas where blood flows. SPECT scans are cheaper and more readily available than higher resolution PET scans. The controversy around SPECT, though, is that some believe they're exposing you needlessly to radiation. So what does a SPECT scan show? It's primarily used to view blood flow through arteries and veins in the brains, but tests have shown that it might be more sensitive to brain injuries than either MRI or CAT scans because it can detect reduced blood flow to those injury sites. SPECT scanning is also useful for pre-surgical evaluation of medically uncontrolled seizures. The test can be performed between seizures or during a seizure to determine blood flow to the area where the seizure originated. There is a doctor by the name of Daniel Amen who utilizes SPECT for the specific use of mental health diagnosis and treatment. I've included a TED Talk and would encourage you to watch it in this week's Canvas. It's super interesting, even though he does find controversy in what he's doing. Anyways, I hope you have a better understanding of how we see inside the brain and the different ways technology has helped us do that.